Welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, where we explore the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive way forward. I'm your host, Morag Gamble, permaculture educator and global ambassador, filmmaker, eco-villager, food forester, mother, practivist, and all-round lover of thinking, communicating, and acting regeneratively. For a long time, it's been clear to me that to shift trajectory to a thriving one-planet way of life, we first need to shift our thinking. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to nature, self, and community is the core. So this is true now more than ever, and even the way change is changing. Unprecedented changes are happening all around us at a rapid pace. So how do we make sense of this? To know which way to turn, to know what action to focus on, so our efforts are worthwhile and nourishing and are working towards resilience, regeneration, and reconnection. What better way to make sense than to join together with others in open, generative conversation? In this podcast, I'll share conversations with my friends and colleagues, people who inspire and challenge me in their ways of thinking, connecting and acting. These wonderful people are thinkers, doers, activists, scholars, writers, leaders, farmers, educators, people whose work informs permaculture and spark the imagination of what a post-COVID, climate-resilient, socially just future could look like. Their ideas and projects help us to make sense in this changing world, to compost and digest the ideas, and to nurture the fertile ground for new ideas, connections and actions. Together we'll open up conversations in the world of permaculture design, regenerative thinking, community action, earth repair, eco-literacy and much more. I can't wait to share these conversations with you. Over the last 3 decades of personally making sense of the multiple crises we face, I always return to the practical and positive world of permaculture, with its ethics of earth care, people care and fair share. I've seen firsthand how adaptable and responsive it can be in all contexts, from urban to rural, from refugee camps to suburbs. It helps people make sense of what's happening around them and to learn accessible design tools to shape their habitat positively and to contribute to cultural and ecological regeneration. This is why I've created the Permaculture Educators Program, to help thousands of people to become permaculture teachers everywhere through an interactive online dual certificate of permaculture design and teaching. We sponsor global perma-youth programs, women's self-help groups in the Global South, and teens in refugee camps. So anyway, this podcast is sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute and our Permaculture Educators Program. If you'd like to find more about permaculture, I've created a 4-part permaculture video series to explain what permaculture is and also how you can make it your livelihood as well as your way of life. We'd love to invite you to join our wonderfully inspiring, friendly and supportive global learning community. So I welcome you to share each of these conversations, and I'd also like to suggest you create a local conversation circle to explore the ideas shared in each show and discuss together how this makes sense in your local community and environment. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet and speak with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's a great pleasure to welcome to the show today Caroline Aitken of Whitefield Permaculture. Caroline's a permaculture teacher and permaculture designer. She's been teaching permaculture at Schumacher College and has spent the last few years developing the Bachelor of Science in Regenerative Food and Farming at the college. I welcome you to join us in this conversation as we explore the current state of the food system and discuss the emerging news stories of regenerative food and farming. Enjoy. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the show today, Caroline. It's an absolute delight to have you on Sense Making in the Changing World. One of the things that we have in common is a love of permaculture and also a focus on looking at the big picture of what's going on in the food system. And also another thread in common is that we both have been inspired in some way or other by Patrick Whitefield in permaculture. Me in a very minor way. I remember when I was 23, I was at Schumacher College and Patrick came in to run a program at Schumacher College about listening to the land, and there was something about what he was doing there just was so grounding after being so much in our head at the college. And he was talking about permaculture, and it reminded me of something that my dad had talked about all the time when I was a kid. And it really switched me back onto it. And I know that you've spent a lot of time with Patrick as well.
Thank you.
So maybe we just start there. It's like, where and how did your life enter into the world or connect with the world of permaculture?
So a slightly sort of roundabout route, really. So I originally studied design, and I was working as a product designer in the UK, and decided to go off travelling, as many people do. And I travelled around Australia. And so I did a year in Australia, and I did a certain amount of working on farms. And that's where I first came across the word permaculture. And I can remember by the time I left Australia having a sort of a vague sense of what it was and what it was all about. But I was really excited by it, and I wanted to know more. So I came back to the UK, and I sort of looked it up, and I did some searches. And the first person that I found online was Patrick Whitefield. And I came across his book, The Earth Care Manual. And I can remember buying the book and sort of getting home with it, this huge tome of a book, with the planet Earth on the front. And I just sort of absorbed the whole thing, and it completely blew my mind. And I think a lot of people experience this with permaculture, that it just makes so much sense. And it ties lots of things together, and it's a real light bulb moment for a lot of us. So I went and studied with Patrick. I did a permaculture design course with him at Ragman's Lane Farm, a wonderful permaculture farm in Gloucestershire. And we did those 2 weeks, and it was quite a nice story, actually, because I, at the time, was working on a farm in Devon, and I was sort of doing a bit of work cooking and really kind of scraping a living. And Patrick had offered me a really incredible concession so that I could take part in the course. And so while I was there, I helped out lots. And in the end, they said, "Hey, would you like to come back and be the course cook?" And so I started cooking for the courses. And then Patrick offered me an apprenticeship, a teaching apprenticeship. And that's really how it all began. So I was working on the farm, and I was learning about permaculture, and it really, everything just sort of fell into place, really. So Patrick and I worked together for a few years, teaching alongside each other and doing land design work together, until he handed the business to me when he became unwell. And that's why my business is called Whitefield Permaculture, because I kind of took on the baton and has been carrying on with that work.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And so you've carried on that work, and now you're in Devon, around the corner from a place called Schumacher College, and you've been teaching permaculture there into the various food systems courses, which is wonderful. So what does permaculture look like at Schumacher College and Dartington these days? How does it manifest in that context? Because I know it's quite a different world than, say, my subtropical permaculture garden out here, for example.
Yes. So what we have here, I mean, Devon is such a traditional farming region. It's really famous in the UK for its big green rolling hills and the patchwork landscapes, and so really a lot of Devon is still very traditional and very rural, and it's a lot of grass. So it's a very wet climate here, and we tend to have quite heavy soils. So it's not the best place for growing crops. So you're mostly seeing cows and sheep in the landscape. And Schumacher College is based in a really old estate. So in England, a lot of our land is sort of formed into these historic estates. And the Dartington estate is 1,200 acres in a beautiful part of South Devon. And it has a really interesting history, but possibly the most interesting part of the history, as far as we might be concerned, is when the Elmhurst family took it on around 100 years ago, and began using the land for innovating in ecology, in the arts, and in farming. And they did some pretty wacky way out experiments in all kinds of different things. But farming was one of the key focuses. And then 30 years ago, I think we're coming up to the 30th anniversary of Schumacher College. Satish Kumar and a number of other people formed Schumacher College on the Dartington estate. And again, their focus, inspired by E.F. Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful, was to create a college where people could come and learn and really, really sort of think differently about the world and really tackle some of the big philosophical questions of life, the universe, and everything. And so they've been running a number of postgraduate courses and lots of short courses there for the past 30 years. And so the permaculture thread, certainly the part that I've been involved with the last few years is they run a practical 6-month course called the Practical Residency in Sustainable Horticulture, which is a really hands-on course. And the students who come onto that program are working in these really diverse demonstration gardens at the college on campus, demonstrating lots of different regenerative food production approaches and actually producing a really huge proportion of the food for the college. And so the permaculture design course is embedded into that program. And many of the people who come onto that course will go off and work in maybe setting up their own food enterprises or working in other really quite sort of innovative and cutting edge food projects and enterprises.
That's so wonderful. It's so fantastic that a place like Schumacher College has really embraced the idea of having a permaculture course as part of it. But now it's kind of evolving into something quite even more complex than that. And I see both in the education side of things that you've been working on, but also in terms of the reimagining of what's happening on the estate. So maybe if we could just start with the estate first and then come back to the program that you've been working on. So the what is the big picture vision now for this 1,200 acres? It's just had a new vision really for it in the last few years. Can you talk about that maybe?
Yes. So estates and often have quite an interesting sort of they have interesting journeys and they have different chapters, where there are different people who come in with different visions. So they often sort of go through these periodic sort of, new manifestations. And back in 2012, Dartington decided to do a complete review of the way in which they use their land on the estate. And it had at that point sort of become really quite conventional in terms of the kind of farming tendencies and the kind of practices that were happening on the estate. And so really the trust felt that it was time to really examine that, given really the kind of the growing understanding of the way in which how we farm can influence the environment and our society. And so they commissioned the land use review in 2012. They really had a look at what they had on the estate and what they could be doing to sort of further those aims of sort of learning and benefiting society as a whole, which is what the estate's always been about. So the land use review led to this whole rethink about the use of the land, and what they wanted to do was to really diversify the kind of land management that was happening and bring more people in to make use of that land. And so since then, that's exactly what's happened. And we now see an estate which is made up of multiple tenancies, lots of different and really interesting land-based enterprises, farms, businesses, projects, charities, community interest companies. And so it's really, really evolved into this fantastic sort of complex ecosystem of activity. And So what's happening now is that really as a result of that, people started to come to Dartington to see what was happening and to engage with these projects. And people started coming from all over the world to see what was happening on the estate. And so that really led Schumacher College to think, hang on a minute, we need to be maybe renewing our focus on food in the ecosystem. And so that's led the college to start developing more food and farming related programs, because of course it just it works so beautifully with what's happening in the estate. So there are more food and farming related short courses, and we now have a BSc, the first undergraduate program at Schumacher College, due to open in September, which is a BSc in regenerative food and farming, which is what I've been really focusing on in the last 2 to 3 years. And we have a MSc Regenerative Food and Farming Enterprise, which is due to open in January. And then coming up soon will be an MA in Sustainable Food Systems. So really, we're just kind of, we're developing, we're sort of bringing together everything that's already happening. And we're really optimizing that to kind of communicate these ideas in the most effective way. And I can certainly talk more about what led to the undergraduate program.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear more about where that came from and what are the sort of key issues that you're focusing on there, because I know that it's going to be something that will attract people from around the world to be part of this. So obviously it has sort of that big picture global perspective, but also something that brings people into sort of very local as well. So how is it, where did it come from, and what are some of the key elements that you've woven into that?
Yeah, so we really started with the big picture with this. Back in 2017, I was commissioned by the head of college to do a study which we called the Food Culture Study. And this was triggered by not only what was happening on the estate, but also we started to see really large international organisations and national governments really beginning to strongly advocate a widespread transition towards agroecological systems. And so for the Permies listening, agroecology is very much, it's informed by the principles of ecology in very much the same way permaculture is. And it's just very specifically focused on agriculture and rural communities. But it's as much a social movement as it is an environmental movement, because it's really looking at food justice and food sovereignty as well as the environmental, harmonious environmental food production. So this study was a fantastic way to kind of really get out and talk to all sorts of different groups and stakeholders about what they felt was needed from educators like Schumacher College in order to aid this transition. So I went out and I spoke to farmers and growers and food business people, and I spoke to policymakers, change makers, and educators, and all sorts of different groups within the sector. And I asked them what they felt was needed. And we put all of that into, and I sort of evaluated all of that vast body of information. And alongside that, looked at what is currently available in terms of training, because we have this huge advocacy for agroecology and the transition. And what I found certainly in the UK, and I did look a little bit further afield as well, and found that actually there isn't really substantial training in order for people to respond to those calls. Mm-hmm. So in the UK, there were some huge gaps that I identified. So having identified what the sector felt was needed and what was actually available, then we just kind of said, okay, well, let's see how we can fill those gaps. And as a higher education institution, the obvious route was to create a really good comprehensive higher education program, which is why, in this instance, it was an undergraduate program. And we realised that other large agricultural universities have these really substantial degree programs for people wanting to go into farming, whether that's straight agriculture or farm business management or whatever it might be, and there was no agroecological equivalent to that. And what's been really fascinating in creating this program and responding directly to what we were told was needed is that we realise, of course, that farming doesn't exist in isolation. It's so completely integrated with society and the environment. And what I found really inspiring when I did this research, and I was already aware of this incredible movement that was growing in the UK, was finding the people who have made their agroecological food and farming enterprises work really kind of against all the odds. And so this led me to these incredible innovators. And so in the UK over the last few years, we've had our particular situation here has been under the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe. Farms under a certain size, so farms under 5 hectares, weren't eligible for any of the farming subsidies. And so the situation with farming subsidies in the UK is that it generally makes up about half of the whole farm income. So it's a really big chunk.
That's huge.
Huge, yeah. So we have with a situation where it is that a lot of our farmers are entirely dependent upon those subsidies. And the reason they're dependent is because we've had this increasing situation where the value of food has remained static or in fact dropped. So their farm gate prices are staying the same or dropping. The cost of their inputs and their overheads, of course, are always creeping up. They've reached peak efficacy for nitrogen fertilizers. Then it's not, they can't throw any more on to get any more yield now. That's not happening anymore. You have pesticide resistance in pests and diseases. And so really they've got nowhere to go. And of course, a lot of the natural capital has been lost through soil erosion, etc. So we have this really very vulnerable situation in conventional farming. Meanwhile, we have these small farms who have not been eligible for that support and therefore haven't developed that dependency, but rather have developed innovative ways of surviving. And so while our farm numbers, we've been losing farms hand over fist since 2005, and yet we've been gaining small farms, slowly, gradually. So we have these small food and farming enterprises who have gone, okay, we don't have subsidies. We can't compete with the big farms in terms of selling on the commodity market. So we're going to find direct routes to our local market. So they've developed things like local box schemes, community-supported agriculture schemes where they get a buy-in from their community, which gives them that sense of that financial security to keep going year on year. They have formed food hubs, food cooperatives, all of these ways in which they can sell directly to their local community and get a much bigger proportion of the food pound. So if a farmer sells directly to a supermarket, they tend to receive around 8 pence of the food pound. Whereas if they're selling directly to their community, they're getting more like the sort of the complete opposite of that, more like 92p of the food pound.
Let's just say that again, just so that it was clear, because sometimes the sound is going out a bit. And I don't know if people heard that was 8p in the pound that traditional farming is getting, and that's flipped for that's huge. Yeah. And I wonder too. I wonder about the ages of farmers. So here in Australia, sort of the general age of a typical farmer, a typical farming system is around retirement age. Whereas when we look at the sort of the new farms, these regenerative farms that are coming up, they're typically a new generation of farmers coming through. Is that being seen in your context as well?
Absolutely, and I believe it's the same picture in many of the much of the global north. So yes, the reason that the average age of the farmer is going up, and in the UK, I often see sort of 58, 59 as the average age. And this is because we have a big issue with family farm succession, which is the younger generation wanting to take on and continue the family farm business. And who can blame them? That farmers have had a really hard time in recent years, with exactly that picture that I described. And so the young people that we're seeing coming into farming tend to be coming into this very new and different kind of farming. And often they're not from farming backgrounds at all. Many are young career changers, actually, who may have studied something, a bit like me. I studied design and I ended up farming, but we're being drawn to it because it's one of the rare good news stories, I think, is a big part of it. There are so many bad news stories, in the world and at the moment. And farming it is such a good news story. If we farm in the right way, we can solve many of those really big problems with the food and, food inequality, environmental degradation, food waste, food miles, all of these different issues, And so people kind of are drawn into something that feels like a meaningful livelihood. And certainly the small farm movement that's been developing here in the last 10, 15 years, it's so thriving and it's so positive and a really supportive network. And you have networks like the Land Workers Alliance, for example, who are part of the global Via Campasina network. And they have these fantastic networking events. They're really supportive. They offer training and advice, and they're also lobbying the government on positive policy changes as well. So it's a really exciting thing to be a part of.
I wanted to ask you about that with the subsidies. I mean, if 50% of farmers' income is subsidies and kind of hitting a wall and the price that farmers are getting is so low, is there shift happening at that subsidy level? Is there some turnaround that's taking place in response to this? What are you seeing happening?
Yeah, so gosh, it's a really interesting time here in the UK for agriculture policy. As you know, we've left the European Union. And so we've had the first chance in 50 years to rewrite our agriculture policy. And it's been people have been very engaged with that. It's such an opportunity. And so where we're at with that now is that the government have announced, that we have an Agriculture Act, which came about as a result of, the public consultation and the little ping pong that happens here between the Commons and the Lords to get bills through. And we have the Act, but we are still with DEFRA, who's the Department for Environment and Food here, are still piloting and trialling the new subsidy scheme. So it will take a while to transition out of the common agricultural policy subsidies into these new subsidies. And so the bad news at the moment is that there's a lot of uncertainty because farmers don't yet know exactly what they'll be eligible for and what they might have to do in order to be eligible. But the good news is that the new farming subsidies are very heavily based upon environmental land management. So they are looking to the sort of tagline is public money for public goods. So the government have really taken on board this idea of not really a term I like to use, but natural capital, the importance of natural capital and sort of, that actually those things like biodiversity and carbon sequestration and flood mitigation and heritage, they are public assets, and so that's really great.
Fantastic.
It would be nice to see more support for whole farm systems and agroecological approaches, because I think the concern is that if we continue to sort of put different types of land management into separate silos, we're not encouraging people to kind of really integrate those different components and get the incredible multiple benefits that you get from that integration.
I wonder too whether there's support for those small farmers in this new policy that...
We don't know yet is the answer. So they have made, they have been saying, the rhetoric has been very positive. They want these subsidies to be available for all farmers. I think there's a little bit of nervousness around this at the moment because certainly to begin with, it will only be the recipients of the former scheme who will actually be eligible for the new scheme. And they are saying that they will gradually bring more and more people in. And we just have to, I think any time where there is new policy being formed and there's an opportunity for public engagement in forming that policy, we have to be diligent and we have to keep engaging with it and just keep on telling them what we want.
Yeah. Yeah. So in your research that you've done around I don't know how far you looked, but what were some of those? You've talked about good news stories. I'm just wondering, what are some of those really interesting type of food systems examples that you've seen that highlight this new paradigm of the food systems and just make you feel really hopeful?
Yeah, so we're lucky we've got quite a few on our doorstep here in Dartington. So we talked about some of the big issues of the food system and two of those being food equality and also waste. And there's a brilliant project here at Dartington called Food and Community, a little community interest company who gather up food waste from various different retailers and service providers, and they redistribute that food waste to people in food poverty in the local area. And I don't know, it may be surprising for some listeners to hear that in the UK we have a real issue with food poverty, and food banks are being drawn upon in a way that they haven't been for a very long time. And so Food and Community, not only do they redistribute the food waste, so that's kind of, that's solving two issues in one hit, but also they realise that obviously there are these bigger systemic issues underlying all of this. And so they also train people up. They run little courses and community building events. So they're bringing communities together, teaching people about how to source good food, how to cook with it, how to eat healthily. So really, really inspiring.
Wonderful
project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And others around, you mentioned, food cooperatives and CSAs and there's farmers markets as well. Like how much has that spread throughout the UK? I remember way back in 1992 seeing the emergence of some of the first farmers markets around, I think it was around Bristol area, and it just seems like it's just spread so amazingly. So is that something that you see has really landed in the kind of the food culture where you are, or is it still in pockets?
Yeah, no, it really has, and because I remember the first farmers markets, I remember being at art college and it being quite a novel thing, and it was certainly quite a kind of, it was quite a middle class thing, to be honest, at the time. It was really for more affluent people. And so I went to art college in Winchester, which is this beautiful historic city, and it was, it was all very middle class and lovely and
gourmet.
But it's evolved since then, and I think that there may still be a little bit of an association with those former days of the farmers market. But I think what's changed is small farmers starting up things like these direct sales models of vegetable box schemes, meat box schemes, and often having a pickup service at local farmers markets. And because these producers are selling directly to their consumers, they are able to keep their food at a very affordable price for people. And of course, you still have your kind of your high end products, but a lot of producers, I think, feel that if they can offer their food at an affordable price, then they do. So I would say that pretty much, every town and city in the land now has some kind of farmers farmers market or producer hub or box scheme available. So
wonderful. That's quite a massive shift in a short period of time, really, hasn't it? It's kind of been embraced so much. And it's really lovely, too, to hear that it's shifted. So, you started talking about the food and community addressing food poverty, and then, farmers market being sort of a gourmet end of the local food system. But really filling in the gaps has been something that I've been really interested in over the years too, that it's actually just becomes really accessible, and that it's real food for everyday people, and that we find ways that good food is just a basic human right, not a privilege. And so it's great to hear that that's starting to happen with so many things. And I wonder too whether you're seeing any permaculture farms that are integrating with these. Are there any kind of really interesting permaculture farms that you've seen marketing their produce in this way and being a really successful example of a local food system?
Absolutely. I mean, luckily there's one right on our doorstep here at Dartington. So the Apricot Centre, which runs from Huxhams Cross Farm, which is a biodynamic permaculture farm, and really diverse, fantastic, diverse integrated permaculture systems. They've got vegetables, they do chickens and eggs, they have soft fruit and they have top fruit, and they also do grains. So very diverse. And they run a box scheme and they sell out to various shops here as well. But they're very collaborative. And so they're engaging a lot with the community. There's also a care farm element of their work as well. They do some therapeutic stuff. So very engaged in community. But they're working with other enterprises on the estate in lots of different ways. One of my favourite projects is the Dartington Mill, which is a collaboration between Huxhams Cross Farm, Old Parsonage Farm, which is the biggest farm here on the estate, and an incredible artisan baker called the Almond Thief, which is in Dartington, and bakes the most incredible bread. And so they've been collaborating on growing population grains and trying to sort of develop land races. Because, as I said earlier, Devon it's not known for its grain growing potential, so it's really important that we develop those land races that work here in this climate and this soil. And so they've been doing growing the grain, processing it here at Dartington, and then so milling it, and then selling it as bags of flour to the community locally, and then also having it baked into these wonderful products. The almond food. And
I think that's something that I remember Schumacher College being really strong about, is this immersion in food, that every day at the college, particularly for the residential programs, that there's some way of being involved in the harvesting and the cooking and then sharing the meals together, and that the whole conversation around food, and particularly Satish talking about a loaf of bread, a loaf of bread just not being a loaf of bread. There's so much more to it. And so the fact that, you now have local bakeries like this, it's phenomenal. I know Schumacher's been making their own bread, but maybe not from such incredible local grain. I mean, if that can be coming right from the estate, that's amazing. And what a brilliant thing to be able to bring in students in this new program, to be able to be studying a bachelor's, but then being immersed in all of these programs. So I think I heard you mention, maybe it was in another conversation that we had, that students who do this program will also have a chance to kind of meet all these different, will they get a chance to go out and work with them, or how does that kind of learning pathway work?
Well, absolutely they will. So the sort of the threads of the program, the really strong threads, where obviously the regenerative food production, so the kind of the real cutting edge technologies and methodologies for regenerative agriculture. Then the business skills. So this was something that obviously often people who are drawn to a land-based livelihood don't come from a business background necessarily or have those skills. So that was something key. Also, a basic understanding of biosciences and sort of agroecological sciences was key because, of course, ecology underpins all of that practice. Mm-hmm. And so, and then sort of, the sort of the bigger picture, contextual stuff, like understanding the food system and how it works, and really being able to sort of critically analyse different approaches to food and farming. And so what we wanted to do was to give people this really rounded package of knowledge and understanding and practical skills, so that when they graduate, they're ready to go. But we knew that we needed to reference real life and real practice as often as possible. So in pretty much every module on the course, they will be coming into contact with lecturers coming in, field trips, field work, case studies of different projects and enterprises, tours and visits, so that we can really tap into all of this incredible stuff that's happening and show the students these incredibly inspiring examples of how people have made things work and really made them work. And and to show the benefits of collaboration, allow students to learn from all of this incredible learning that's gone on in these last 15, 20 years out there in the field, of how to engage with your community and find innovative routes to market. So yes, they will be. I mean, what a context to run this course in.
Fantastic. I'm just imagining all these people who are coming to that and then going out. And I know that some of them will be from overseas, but I wonder, how does it work where you are for people who are not from a land-based community who want to become farmers? If you're not having the land handed down through the generations, how hard is it now to access a piece of land? And is it actually creating an innovation in the way that people work together to access the land? What's your noticings there?
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely, good observation. It's another key area of innovation. So yeah, we in the UK, we do have an issue with access to land, and this partly to do with the way that the land is owned here, but it's also to do with land prices having been pushed up over the years because of the Common Agricultural Policy, actually, which paid farmers by area for the land that they owned and farmed. So that has exaggerated the issue somewhat, but again, it's led to innovation. So there are all sorts of organisations who help young people, new entrants to farming, in gaining access to land. There's the Ecological Land Co-operative, which creates land trusts and then really sort of fair tenancy for people. There are farm start organisations, increasing incubators for new entrants, and it's something that we are planning to develop here on the estate as well. There's one thing that we are rich in is land, and so we are, we'll be looking into having incubator plots as well to kind of springboard people into a better position from which to start.
Fantastic. Can you talk a little bit more about farmland trusts? Because I think this is something that's really very interesting, and it doesn't really exist in Australia. And I think it's something that would be a wonderful thing to do, because it's kind of a similar situation here where, unless you handed down farmland from older generations, the prices of land in Australia have just gone horrendously high as well. And so there's lots of different ways that people are starting to approach accessing land. But one of them, I think, that really holds a lot of potential is this notion of a farmland trust. We have bushland trusts. Cities are buying up bushland because they're valuing the importance of having bushland in and around cities. And so, one of the things that I've been talking with various councils is, well, let's have a look at the remnant farmland in and around our cities, because, here in Australia, we only really have cities and suburbs, and then little bits. It's not like this mosaic of towns and villages everywhere. So looking at what's around the city and thinking, well, how can we as a collective, as a commons, protect these farm areas and put them into farmland trusts, and then create some kind of like some sort of covenant on the top that means that they're farmed regeneratively, and there could be ecology of systems that happen there. So this is the sort of ideas that are bubbling up, but we don't really have anything that's really landed. And I'd love to hear some examples or ideas or things that are bubbling up in your part of the world.
Yes, there are a number of different sort of approaches to this, really. And again, we've got an interesting history with that, because it used to be that we had council-owned farms, county farms here, and gradually, unfortunately, a lot of those have been sold off over the years. So there's a renewed focus on kind of, pushing for county farms to come back, because that's always been a really great way for new entrants without sort of, private funds to access farming and to get into farming. So that's one thing. If that's never been a thing, where you are, then community land trust and sort of charitable land trust are another thing to look at. And so essentially that is raising money from stakeholders to buy the piece of land, and then to give just very fair and equitable leases on those lands, and the land will be held in trust for a very long period of time to give security to those tenants. Another interesting thing that's happening here, because so much of our land is owned by relatively few people. And so there's been interesting conversations going on with large landowners in recent times, and these ideas about farm share agreements, which can help small enterprises get going by sort of having little or sort of peppercorn rent, but sort of paying a little bit of their profit to the landowner, and then the landowner is then invested in their success. And also, sometimes it's just a little bit of a mindset change, actually, because landowners are used to renting out large tenancies, and often they're not hugely, historically haven't been hugely interested in sort of renting out a 5-acre parcel, because while it's a bit, annoying to have to fence off a 5-acre corner of the field, So there's a kind of a mindset change here of landowners kind of thinking, well, okay, maybe I could sort of section off a few areas of field and let those out to small enterprises. So I think, as with many things, I think it's often multiple solutions.
Yeah. You have what about the history of the commons over there, and whether are there still any commons in existence? And how does that work in terms of accessing that land for these types of initiatives?
Yeah, so the commons are generally, there's different definitions of the word, the commons, but we do still have common pieces of land, which are essentially forever the local farming community have access rights to using that land. So it's usually fairly low-grade grazing land that very specific members of the local community are allowed to graze their animals on for different periods of time. So they they'll each have their number of days that they're allowed to take their animals on. So for example, Dartmoor, where I live, much of Dartmoor is commons, and there are grazers who, for generations of their family, have rights to graze their cattle on Dartmoor.
So who manages the commons and says who can have it and who can't have it, and how do you shift those intergenerational things to maybe have different things happening there? Or is it just simply that they are marginal lands and that's really all that can happen?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know. It's not my area of great specialism, but there's been a lot of work done on that in recent years. And I think if you're interested in looking at land ownership in the UK specifically, I would certainly point people towards Guy Shrubsole, who wrote a fantastic book called Who Owns England and has a website full of fascinating information.
Can you just say that again? I didn't quite catch the name of the book or the author. Yeah.
Okay, so it's Guy Shrubsole, which is a great name. Mm-hmm. And the book was Who Owns England?
Ah, okay. Who Owns England? Right.
So that's really interesting. But also, again, the Land Workers Alliance have done a lot of work on land rights and land access.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So what are the sort of books and films or things that are inspiring you at the moment? What are you reading?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I've actually, there are always so many, which is a great
I know.
A really big stack next to my bed, which I'm trying to get through. At the moment, actually, I've been reading a number of books published by Chelsea Green, who are one of our partners at Dartington, because I've been interviewing some of their authors who have written food and farming related books. And so I've had the treat of having these wonderful books coming through my door that I need to read. And one of those I particularly enjoyed was A Small Farm Future by Chris Smaje, which is fascinating because really, so Chris originally was an anthropologist, a social scientist. And this really comes through in the book. It's so well researched and all laid out. And he became a farmer and very much a permaculture farmer. And he was really interested in this idea. A big part of the philosophy in permaculture really is that we can, the question of can permaculture feed the world? Well, the answer is actually it kind of is feeding about 70% of the world right now, because that's what the way in which the majority of the world's people are fed is by these small-scale, diverse, integrated farming systems. And so Chris was really interested in looking at, well, what would happen? How would it look if we in the global north changed the way that we produce food in that way? And so he really explores, the physical, the practical, the spiritual, the social elements of that and lays out this picture of a future in which we are fed by small farms. So that's fascinating. And at the moment I'm reading Farming on the Wild Side by Nancy and John Hayden, which is lovely, an inspiring story of the way in which they transitioned to agroecology on their farm in Vermont. And so you just see it's one of those books where you have these wonderful sort of the stark picture of this very conventional farm, which is so just, sort of ecological desert, really, your standard classic monoculture. And then gradually, they add in all these components and they tie them together, and you see this beautiful diversification of the farm over time.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you for sharing those examples. I wonder too whether in terms of the listeners, what are some of the things that you would like to maybe let them know about how they can get in touch with you about the different programs that you've talked about, but also some things that you'd like to maybe encourage them to kind of dive in and have a look more at possibly?
Absolutely. So you can have a look at my website, which is whitefieldpermaculture.co.uk, and that has all sorts of stuff on it, but also information about the courses and the land design things that I do. You can check out the Schumacher College website, which is schumachercollege.org.uk, and there you'll find all the information about the BSc Regenerative Food and Farming, which you have all the modules laid out and you'll get a real picture of the course. And if you want to know more about that course, then we're doing these live chats events. So again, have a look at the college website and also the Dartington website, which is dartington.org. And you'll find the dates for the live chats where you can actually come and talk to me online, and I'll talk more about the content of the course and answer any questions. We actually have a virtual open evening, which is tomorrow evening as well. So you can find links to that on all of our Facebook pages, the Schumacher College, Dartington Trust, and my Facebook pages as well. And so do come and have a look if you want to know more about the college and what it's like and the different courses that are available. But in terms of how people can get involved, I think one of the most important and most empowering things that we can do is to engage with our local food producers and engage with our local community in doing that. You know, the way that we spend our food pound is really powerful, you know, and so if we were to, you know, if we can grow any of our own food, again, it may seem like a really small thing, but it's a big impact if lots of us are doing it. And then when we go out and we engage with our local producers and we form a relationship with them, it's a really powerful thing. So I think, and it's a really positive thing too. It's, you know.
Yeah, I mean the multiple benefits of it and the ripple effects of it are quite profound. You know, it's just in a way, it's kind of a beginning point, isn't it? When you start to talk about the food system, you can talk about everything from there. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why I focused on permaculture and food, because you can look at health, you can look at education, you can look at, you know, all different sorts of, you know, ecological restoration and local economy and all of these things together through the focus on what we do with food. So it's a wonderful program, and you know, everything that you've been researching and pulling together. Thank you so much for taking the time to describe that to us and to share that. I hope that many of the listeners might follow through and check out what's going on over at Schumacher College, because even though, you know, you may or may not be able to partake in the long course, there's always short courses that are there as well, and all sorts of things that are going on within this world. And yeah, like you're saying, find a way to support your local grower and your local community, and maybe consider, you know, the whole idea of maybe you could be a farmer too. There's someone else who I just interviewed the other week who used to be a builder, and it took on 1 acre piece of farm, and it left the city and now makes his entire living for his family from this 1 acre, and with 11 streams of income. And it's just a fascinating story that it's a shift in our narrative thinking that, you know, the farmers are sort of out there and they have big plots and they don't really, you know, it's this distant thing, you know, particularly for urban dwellers. And, you know, this whole idea that we could actually shift and change and become more totally engaged in our food system. Look, it's just wonderful. And I'm so glad to hear the stories about how it's just taken off in every single community, you know, every single town around the UK. I hope that it does that here in Australia as well. Yeah. So thank you for your time. It's been lovely to chat with you and see you again. And I hope to stay in touch and talk more about all the different work that we collectively do in all our different parts of the world.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Morag. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. So that's all for today. Thanks so much for joining us. Head on over to my YouTube channel, the link's below, and then you'll be able to watch this conversation, but also make sure that you subscribe, because that way you'll be notified of all new films that come out, and also you'll get notified of all the new interviews and conversations that come out. So thanks again for joining us. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.